If you're passionate about classical education and you're looking for the next step, Hillsdale College's Diana Davis Spencer Graduate School of Classical Education is now offering 2 master's degree programs. These programs provide students with a broad philosophical, historical, literary, and pedagogical perspective on classical education. The Master of Arts in Classical Education is a 2-year, in-person program on Hillsdale's campus in Michigan, while the Master of Classical Education Leadership is a 3-year hybrid program with a 1-week summer class held at Hillsdale College. Whether you're interested in teaching, administration, or another area within the field of classical education, we're prepared to offer you a foundational, time-proven approach to your studies. We want to see your application soon. Applications must be submitted on or before December 15th, 2024 for full consideration. To learn more and submit your application, visit classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu. That's classicalgrad.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scot Bertram.
Thanks for listening. The Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast is part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. You also can find more information on topics and ideas discussed on this show at our website, k12.hillsdale.edu. We're joined today by Colin Mullaney. He is Assistant Director of School Leader Development in Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office. Colin, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Scott.
Talking today about valuing virtue in parents or for parents. Let's talk first about that word virtue. How should we define it? How should we think about this idea of virtue?
Yeah, virtue it's moral excellence is what virtue is. It's classically defined as the mean or the middle ground between 2 extremes. And so courage, for instance, is the middle ground between cowardice, which is valuing your own life or something more than something that's really valuable, or foolhardiness, which is risking your life over something that's not valuable. So each time we think about virtue, there's an element of prudence involved, which is identifying what that right middle ground is.
Go ahead.
That ultimately just leads to moral excellence.
Moral excellence sounds like it takes a lot of work, perhaps at a daily basis. How can parents out there think about their partnership with their school, providing that continuity between locations throughout the day, throughout the year, in virtue instruction?
Right. A really important question. Of course, it starts with choosing an excellent school, a school that focuses on this. But what a school is going to start with and what parents need to start with is this sense of what we're working toward. When we talk about developing virtue, we're not talking about some kind of regimen of discipline or just creating a system of compliance. It's not also about creating or guiding students to be more, quote, successful according to popular metrics or even standard academic metrics. It's really about growing the student, growing the child for their own sake, because virtuous living is the path to flourishing. It's the path of human happiness. And so working with a child or with anybody to help them grow in virtue is really an act of love. It's doing something for that person's own sake for the long term. So I'll just... A second part of that is that when we're thinking about this, we need to ground ourselves like a school would in who children are, who people are at a fundamental level. So especially as parents, we see our kids every day, and so we tend to think of them just in our daily interactions. But it's good to remind ourselves that each of us are beings with eternal souls, and that we are created in the image of God, and so we have infinite value. We have just tremendous dignity in our creation, but at the same time, we're imperfect. All of us are flawed, and and another word or meaning of imperfect is incomplete. We're not complete yet. So we, out of love, guide students, our children, to be who they were meant to be, which is virtuous human beings that are continually improving in that virtue on the path to eternity.
What are some specific practices that parents can use to develop that virtue in their children?
Yeah, it's as we're partnering with schools, I'll say several things, and they're all about really being involved in the school. And virtue that's developed within the school is going to be integrated into all aspects. And so the curriculum to begin with, parents should be familiar with the curriculum and particularly the stories that their kids are reading and be able to discuss that with them, not just the plot, but really who the characters are, and to be able to talk about the dilemmas that the characters are in and the challenges that they have to overcome. Likewise, schools, particularly classical schools that are focusing on virtue, will usually highlight specific virtues that the school holds dear. And so parents should know what those virtues are and know what the definitions are and be able to reinforce the use of those virtues in their own home so that the kids really become used to that. And they can add others, of course, which would be important, but just to reinforce that these virtues matter. But it's important also, which is important within a school context as well, that, again, we don't use virtue as some kind of lever or some kind of a tool to force compliance. We need to inspire virtue in others. We don't help people grow into virtue by shaming them into it. So we talk about, as to grow in virtue, you have to identify where people are not being virtuous, but you talk about the action and you don't personalize it. So you can say that somebody was dishonest, but we don't call them a liar, for instance. But also we want to participate in school activities. Schools are going to have several ways that they honor virtue, often in their assemblies, in particular events like poetry teas. So being there and supporting those things and being able to really participate and speak to those is important. And then, as parents get feedback from the school, we often get that in the form of conferences or report cards. We really want to connect with teachers on the virtue of our children, and the behavior of our children, in addition to their academic performance. And so most report cards have some type of a scale that helps define that, or teacher comments. And so we want to make sure we ask about that from teachers, but then share that with our own children, that, hey, it's good that you got these grades, or maybe this grade's not what we were hoping for, but actually, we're really pleased that you've shown perseverance in this. You can show a little more organization. Focusing on those behaviors and the level of virtue that's demonstrated in the classroom should be a priority even over the grades.
I was assisting my son with homework recently, and it was a time-consuming effort, and it was difficult every now and then. And we were right near the end, and I actually was going to kind of let him off at the very end. Like, I think we've gone for. He goes, no, Dad, perseverance is our core virtue this month, so we've got to finish. We've got to finish the thing we've been working on. It's like, great.
Fantastic, yes.
So how as parents perhaps can we recognize those type of opportunities to help our students recognize when those virtues can be applied?
Yeah, well, one is just being aware that of what those virtues are. So that's really helpful. But I used to talk to my own students that virtue or tests of virtue are like a pop quiz. You need to be ready at all times. I think as a parent, there's a similar thing. When we recognize that our children are flawed human beings, like all people, then we can kind of maybe distance ourselves a little bit from behaviors, good or bad, and be in a ready position to support them with discussion of virtue. So in your son's case, son, that was excellent perseverance and continue with this math problem. Or in another case, you could talk about that in fact this wasn't good self-discipline, for instance. But really speaking to virtue in the moment. Virtue has context, and so being able to speak to that in context, which again requires that both we're ready and we know what the virtues that the school is teaching are.
Talking with Colin Mullaney. He is Assistant Director of School Leader Development at Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office, and valuing virtue for parents. We've talked in depth in a few episodes about the moral imagination. So if you can give us a quick definition of what we mean by that, and how do we cultivate the moral imagination in our students?
It's so important in developing virtue. Russell Kirk calls the moral imagination an enduring source of inspiration that elevates us to first principles as it guides us upwards toward virtue, wisdom, and redemption. So another way of saying that is it's really the desire to understand how the world should be ordered and how our own souls should be ordered, and an accompanying desire to work toward that ordering. So it's the moral imagination is something that can be sparked within us, and the spark, the thing that ignites the moral imagination is often good stories. And so the literature that our kids are reading, also the historical stories that they're covering, are a perfect place to kind of get that spark and to understand what it means to be a human being and who we are in this world, and given that, how we should act, what we should do given those circumstances. So those stories, we need to, I just want to be clear, aren't moralizing stories. So, certainly there are some stories that have obvious morals, and those aren't bad, but those aren't the kind of stories that really spark this flame inside of a human soul that wants to grow to be all that you were made to be, to take on great adventure. And so these kinds of stories are stories of adventure. They're stories of challenge and overcoming difficulty, taking on danger. So, of course, they'll vary. When we talk about students, we're talking about a really broad range of ages, but there are great stories at every level that can teach friendship, that can teach perseverance, that can teach self-sacrifice. And again, lots of historical examples in that regard also. And then when we talk about them, we want to talk about the qualities of the characters so that they really become part of our shared experience. So one thing I would recommend to all parents, and that we've learned to do as a family over the last few years, is tremendous amount of out loud reading and having that shared experience of who these characters are. So we get to know the characters together. They're part of our family culture, and then we can relate to the experiences that they have and the qualities they show as examples of virtue, as examples of good and bad choices that are much more powerful than definitions or even a moralistic kind of story or framework.
We've talked a lot today about things to do. Are there any things not to do, or some things we might want to avoid?
Yes, definitely. And I would just say the power of story to create or spark the moral imagination. There's an equivalent power in bad stories, and bad stories are those that just glorify personal freedom at with no responsibility or sacrifice, or even there are a lot of popular modern stories that are simply about nothing else other than violence or destruction or meanness, without any redemption or other qualities. And those kind of stories can darken the soul. They can lead to different kinds of imagination that guide our worldview, either toward just pleasure seeking and ultimate freedom without recognizing our role in the community, or just simply toward dark things. And so those kind of stories, of course, can be in books, but also movies, TV, video games can all paint those types of worldviews. So I think it's really important as parent to be aware of those things that our kids are encountering in all the various kinds of media, because they really can be destructive. Mm-hmm. I think built into that are also, and this is, you can think of it as a don't do or a do, but just simply building good habits are important for developing virtue. Virtue ultimately it's virtuous if it becomes a habit, if it becomes our natural way of acting. But I think all human beings and children in particular, they build habits when they have a structure that helps them to build habits. And so even habits of just good eating, exercise, consistent sleep times, those kinds of things can make us feel better. Mm-hmm. And then it's easier to make good choices. It's easier to choose what's more difficult, but the right choice versus feeling a temptation in one way or another, or an urge to do something and following that without thinking, or just because we don't feel great that day.
Do you have any suggestions for parents who might be dealing with children who are struggling with a particular virtue? If we go back to our perseverance example from earlier, a child who might be having trouble getting to the end of that work, or a child who perhaps says, I know I should do my homework, or I should practice my instrument, but I'd really like to do this thing that I want to do right now. How do you help those students or children who are having difficulty perhaps with some of these core virtues?
Yeah, that's a universal parent experience, I believe. And I would start by saying, from where we started this conversation, that we need to take the long view. We need to recognize that we are working over, not just days and months, but years, and looking toward an eternal horizon. So persistence on parents' part is really important, and consistency, and looking for ways to both correct, but also to celebrate when there are breakthroughs. We do some unique family traditions where we catch some of our kids being good and award them with a special treat, but we make a big deal about it and have everybody stand at attention, and we name the good behavior and do a formal handing off of a piece of candy. But it's, it can perhaps feel a little bit hokey, but it actually is. It's fun, but it also is encouraging to our kids. And so I think that really finding those ways being very aware of those opportunities to praise a good rendition of the virtue. And so it could be that they're not playing their musical instrument, not showing perseverance in that, but you see them showing perseverance elsewhere, and acknowledge that and praise that, and then try to lean into that next time they are needing to show perseverance with their instrument.
So as we leave our listeners today, if we look at perhaps the most important thing we can leave them with, what might that be?
I think the most important thing and the most difficult is that we teach virtue by modeling it. And so as parents, we want our kids to be around people who are virtuous, because that will really influence their own growth and virtue, and we are the most important ones in that. So we have to be very aware of the example that we're setting, the way that that we behave in difficult situations, where what we show to value, how we spend our time. And it includes things like acknowledging that we're working on virtue, and apologizing, if we need to apologize, or at least acknowledge, saying, wow, I didn't show perseverance in that case, or I could have showed more temperance there instead of eating the whole bag of cookies. So, we're all human, working toward being who we were meant to be. And so I think it's a really important lesson for kids to see that their parents are not perfect, but their parents care enough about virtue that they're working toward it. And ideally having a really regular example of what virtue looks like in our day-to-day interactions.
Colin Mullaney is Assistant Director of School Leader Development in Hillsdale College's K-12 Education Office as we talk about valuing virtue for parents. Colin, thanks so much for joining us here on the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast.
Thank you, Scott.
I'm Scot Bertram. We invite you to like us on Facebook. Search for Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education. You also can follow us on Instagram at Hillsdale_K-12. That's Hillsdale_K-12 on Instagram. Thank you for listening to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.